So welcome everyone to the final installment of our semester-long speaker series on law and the production of inequality. Before I announce today's speakers, I want to invite you to our next event, which also has a lot to do with law and the production of inequality, but it's connected to possibly the most blatant form of neo-colonialism that we never talk about, which is Puerto Rico, and in particular, it has to do with Puerto Rico in the wake of the sort of hurricane and law-induced crisis that followed Maria and Irma last year. And so to think about sort of the implications of those events and what they show about the status of the island and our relationship to the island, we're organizing a symposium that will take place Friday and Saturday, November 30 and December 1st, so coming right up. The first event will start here at 2 p.m., but really the keynote event will be a presentation by Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, who's a Puerto Rican activist who's been very involved in just trying to create more resilient social structures in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, working both from New York and from Puerto Rico. And the event will be really interesting. It has a lot of people coming in who are engaging with what's happening in Puerto Rico from so both the perspective of the arts and social activism, food sovereignty, a whole number of things connected both to the last talk we had, which was on food and the food regime, and to what we've been talking about all semester long. So I really encourage you to look at the little flyer that's on your table if you're interested at all in what's happening in Puerto Rico, but also in Houston. So she'll be starting the whole series of events with a presentation in Houston at the Rothko Chapel right before that on Thursday. So in any event, Puerto Rico in the wake of crisis. Take a look and be there because I think it's going to be very interesting. So, but today, excuse me, is on, today is a different sort of event. Today we will be talking about the different approaches to the regulation of sex work. And we're very pleased to have today with us Hila Shamir, who's an associate professor of law at Tel-Aviv University Faculty of Law. She teaches and researches in the fields of employment, labor, immigration, and welfare law with a focus on issues of human trafficking, gender equality, informal work, and welfare state privatization. She has taught at UC Berkeley, at Cornell Law School, and at the Harvard University Department of Government, was a distinguished visiting scholar at the Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley in 2014-2016. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship, of the EU Marie Curie Reintegration Grant, of the Elan Scholars Scholarship for Outstanding Junior Faculty. Before her graduate studies, she served as a law clerk to Justice Maza of the Israeli Supreme Court, and she has published extensively on labor issues generally, but unionization, human trafficking, feminist regulation of sex work, and so on. She has a forthcoming book from Minnesota University Press with some co-editors entitled Governance, Feminism, and Introduction, from which a lot of this work will come today. She has an SJD and an LLM from Harvard Law School and an LLB from Tel Aviv University, where she currently teaches. So, Hila Shamir. But let me introduce Christine first. I'll just introduce them both now, and she will be our respondent. Dr. Christine Williams is a professor of sociology here at UT. She's the Elsie and Stanley E. Skinny Adams Senior Centennial Professor in Liberal Arts, which is quite a title. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. And what we try to do every time we have a speaker in is to provide some sort of interdisciplinary conversation. So she will be coming in from more of a sociology perspective. Her research focuses on gender, race, and class inequality in the workplace. She's the recipient of the American Sociological Association's Jesse Bernard Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of scholarly work that has enlarged the horizons of sociology to encompass fully the role of women in society. She was also awarded the Distinguished Lecturer Award and the Feminist Mentor Award given by Sociologists for Women in Society. Her most recent publications look at how the social inequalities of gender, race, and class are embedded within workplaces, including currently in the oil and gas sector and previously in low-wage retail work. She has studied men and women in non-traditional, gender-atypical occupations, such as men in nursing and women in the Marine Corps. She has studied sexuality, homophobia, and sexual harassment in a variety of workplace settings. In 2018, she became president-elect of the American Sociological Association. So we're very fortunate to have Christine here with us today. So join me in welcoming both Dr. Hila Shamir and Dr. Christine Williams today. And I'll leave you to it.
So thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and thank you to Dan and Kate for inviting me to be part of this series, and to Christine for commenting soon. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a draft article that some of you may have read that I recently wrote. This is the title. But let me begin with a confession. This is perhaps the most normatively complicated article I ever wrote. I feel highly ambivalent about some of its takeaways and some of the positions it leads me to take, and I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts about it in the Q&A. So in a nutshell, in this article, I argue that the two classic governance feminist positions regarding the regulation of prostitution or sex work, on the one hand, neo-abolitionism that seeks to criminalize all involved except the sex worker herself, and on the other hand, deregulation or legalization of sex work, that both of these do not serve well the interest of most sex workers, and definitely of the most vulnerable sex workers. And I suggest that it is time to reconsider governance feminist positions about the regulation of sex work, and call for us feminists to take advantage of the much loathed gap in feminist circles between law in the books and law in action, to create a system that will de jure leave room to handle the most exploitative and abusive manifestations of the sex industry via criminal law, and de facto have a decriminalization policy to most sex work. To sex work that does not involve aggravating circumstances, that provides workers with access to the legal system, workers' rights, social security, the right to unionize, etc. This is therefore an exploration of the potential benefits of postmodern lawmaking that seeks to exploit the difference between the symbolic and the actual, and expand the gap between the law in the books and the law in action. Using Anneliese Ryle's terminology, the article explores the option that such regulation, what she terms regulation with a hollow core, can serve as a placeholder that under certain circumstances can be pursued as an independent regulatory approach with considerable advantages. So this article is a tentative attempt to propose a regulatory path to empower transactional sex work while dismantling the more exploitative elements of the sex industry. Now, I look at the Israeli case study as a possible example of the benefits of this system and contrast it with the classic feminist positions, kind of the paradigmatic feminist legal system in relation to prostitution in the Netherlands and in Sweden. And this is not an easy position for me to take, because one of the things I've been doing on and off for the past 10 years is to help sex workers organize and make their voices heard in Israeli policy debates. This is not a position that sex worker organizations, which I admire and see myself as being in solidarity with, usually take, and possibly for good reason. So the question I want to answer in this talk today is to explain why I take this position and hopefully convince you. So before I turn directly to that question, I would like to introduce you to the two research projects that I have been pursuing in recent years and that come together in this article. So first, I'm currently leading a team of researchers in a research project called TrafLab, Labor Perspectives to Human Trafficking. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip about TrafLab. It'll be easier than explaining what it does. So it's a 2 or 3 minute clip, and then I'll continue from there.
The TrafLab research project, led by Dr. Hila Shamir, seeks to create new theoretical groundings and a novel normative toolkit to combat human trafficking. Human trafficking is one of the greatest challenges of our time. The extent of trafficking is contested. Modest estimates suggest that 2.4 million people worldwide are currently subject to trafficking, but in 2016, barely 3% were identified as victims, and far less were assisted. Come so few. Traditionally, trafficking was thought to be the forced movement of women and girls across borders for the purpose of prostitution. However, contemporary definitions of human trafficking are much broader. Trafficking today, as defined in the Palermo Protocol, includes a wide range of severe forms of labor exploitation of women as well as men, within borders as well as across, where the exploitation is induced by force, threats, and other means such as abuse of a position of vulnerability. What is the alternative? The legal tools currently used, criminalization of traffickers, border control, and ex-post human rights aid, are mostly tailored to the traditional understanding of human trafficking. As a result, they don't target the structural causes that create vulnerability to severe labor exploitation, such as high recruitment fees that create large debt that limit workers' bargaining power, or migration regimes that limit workers' labor market mobility. These include confiscation of passports, preventing workers from leaving their workplace, and providing them with inhumane living conditions and unsafe working environments. Hila Shamir's ERC-funded research, TrafLab, develops a labor perspective to human trafficking, which, instead of focusing on the symptoms, aims to address the root causes of the problem. This approach seeks to transform the structure of labor markets that are particularly susceptible to trafficking by shifting the focus away from individual harms to the power disparities between victims and traffickers, and the economic and social conditions that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking in a globalized economy. The labor approach has the potential to affect significantly more victims by providing them with legal mechanisms for avoiding and resisting exploitation. Solutions will vary by context, but we are already exploring some promising avenues. Bilateral agreements, regulation of human supply chains, protective employment legislation, unionization, and corporate social responsibility. At the TrafLab Research Project, we are drawing the blueprints towards more effective and empowering anti-trafficking policymaking.
So that's TrafLab. That's one thing that I'm doing in recent years. So what we're trying to do, as you understand, is look for a new toolkit to combat human trafficking, moving away from the traditional turn to border control, criminal law, and human rights, ex-post human rights, to a labor perspective that seeks to address the root causes of trafficking and enhance the bargaining power of workers vulnerable to severe forms of exploitation. In this collaboratory, it's made up of an interdisciplinary group of researchers as well as 2 lawyers working in the Workers' Rights Legal Clinic at Tel-Aviv University, to which I serve as an academic advisor to. Through the clinic, we pursue a labor approach to trafficking in real life through litigation, organization, and other means. One of the projects we're doing at the clinic as part of the unionization strategy is organizing sex workers. So Israel never had a sex worker organization. And now, in response to increasing calls for the criminalization of clients, sex workers are coming together for the first time. I was in conversation with some of the sex workers in this group, some of its leaders, for the past 10 years. In fact, they tried to organize and failed in 2009. And it's from this encounter that this article grew. because some of these sex workers are against legalization, and they feel that the current situation, or at least the situation in Israel until recently, was quite good, and in many ways better for them than what legalization will bring. This is debated within the movement, and it's not settled yet. Before I continue, let me just put on the table another key concept that I already used here today, that of governance feminism. So governance feminism is a term that seeks to describe the places and moments where feminist ideas turn to governance practices. It means every form in which feminists and feminist ideas exert a governing will within human affairs. To follow Michel Foucault's definition of governmentality, every form in which feminists and feminist ideas conduct the conduct of men. While the definition can be very wide, in this book and in most of my research as someone interested in law, I address only a subset of these GF moments and concentrate on efforts feminists have made to become incorporated into state-like, and state-affiliated power. So Governance Feminism, an introduction, came out a couple of months ago, and Governance Feminism Notes from the Field is going to come out in February, hopefully. The research we're discussing today is a study of governance feminism in one of its most assertive endeavors, the regulation of sex work. After introducing these two motivating concepts, let me move to the article and to the reason I argue that we need to move to regulation with a hollow core, putting both criminal law and workers' rights at our disposal in regulating sex work. So the feminist, and I'm going to start with the feminist debate over the regulation of prostitution and sex work. And the feminist discussion on the issue of sex work is perhaps one of the most polarized debates in legal feminism, and maybe in feminism in general. Now, I'll divide the debate, and I divide it in the paper, on the proper way to deal with the phenomenon of prostitution to three layers. A normative layer, dealing with the moral and normative implications of selling sex. A factual layer, dealing with our knowledge about sex work and prostitution, and a strategic layer, dealing with the question of what is the appropriate regulatory intervention to deal with the sale of sex. So today I'll try to quickly introduce the two first layers, the normative and the factual, and move directly to the third, the strategic, which tends to be of the greatest interest to lawyers and policymakers. So let's start with the normative layer. So underlying the disagreement, let's stay here for a second. So underlying the disagreements in feminist thought on prostitution, there's a fundamental disagreement about the power, resistance, and sexual agency of women under patriarchy. The feminist camps disagree among themselves on the basic question of whether women can choose to sell sexual services. The ongoing feminist debate can roughly be divided into two polarized positions. I'll call the first one structuralist and the second individualist. So let's begin with the structuralist position. The structuralist position is affiliated with radical feminism. Structuralists see patriarchy as an all-powerful structure that determines each and every gendered interaction. Sexuality, according to this version, is the primary site of women's oppression, and sexual objectification is the key to women's subjection. Sexuality is understood as McKinnon says, that which is most one's own, yet most taken away, since women under patriarchy never possess their sexuality. Prostitution, according to the structure, is the fundamental condition of women. It is the strongest metaphor for women's experience under patriarchy, since it's not only prostitutes who objectify their sexuality. Rather, all women, again I quote Catherine McKinnon, live in sexual objectification the way fish live in water. This follows up on the conversation we had earlier. The theoretical origins of the structuralist view are often said to be Kant's categorical imperative. The idea that people are never to be treated merely as means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves. Sex is perceived as an intrinsic attribute of personhood, part of the individual self-constitution as a person. Therefore, the commodification of sex as a market good used to fulfill the desires of others problematizes women's conception of the self. The causal relationship between the commodification of sexuality, objectification, and subordination is therefore understood to be inherent. The structuralist position, translated into legal reform, advocates therefore a fully abolitionist approach, arguing that prostitution, actually partial abolitionist in the sense that I'm talking about, arguing that prostitution is distinct from other exploitative gendered occupations in that it alienates the woman from her sexuality. Unlike other miserable jobs that women can have, prostitution leads to self-alienation, much like slavery. According to this view, the appropriate legal approach to prostitution is the criminalization of all those profiting from it. The pimp, the John, and any other third party involved, like somebody who rents his apartment or a place. So the woman herself is seen as a victim of violence and therefore not part of the act, and she must not be criminalized. But measures should be taken to rehabilitate her, to help her exit the cycle of prostitution. This position is often called neo-abolitionist, stressing the connection its followers see between slavery and prostitution. In 1999, Sweden became the first country in the world to implement a complete neo-abolitionist approach, when a successful governance feminist campaign to end demand led to the criminalization of consumers of sex services. In the last decade, the Swedish model was adopted in several other countries, and bills in this spirit have become the spearhead for neo-abolitionist governance feminist campaigns in several countries, Israel being one of them. So this is a structuralist approach. On the other side of this feminist debate, there's the individualist. So according to the individualist approach, sex work is not inherently harmful to women. Rather, it's the stigma that accompanies sex work, coupled with its illegality, that causes the harm some sex workers experience. The individualist argument takes varying forms. It can originate from libertarianism, from the politics of sex workers' organizations, or from postmodern pro-sex feminists. Here today, I'll focus on the position of sex workers' organizations and pro-sex feminists. So sex workers' movements demand human, civil, and social rights for sex workers and lobby for the legalization of sex work. Through this movement, sex workers voice their needs and concerns and their opinions, not as victims, but as active agents, seeking to speak for themselves, to be heard, and to be respected. Their call is a call for dignity and a call for inclusion. Postmodern pro-sex feminists see both the market and sexuality as terrains of struggle, constructed by the patriarchal culture, yet not fully determined by it, so that individuals and groups are capable of generating resistance. Further, postmodern feminists acknowledge the multiplicity in women's experiences of sex generally, and thus see paid for sex as having no inherent positive or negative meaning. The assumption that the patriarchal order is not total and that sex work is not inherently coercive opens room for exploration of sex work as potentially pleasurable, empowering, and at the very least as a legitimate way of making a living. The individualist approach does not deny realities of exploitation and coercion. Neither does it imply that all sex work is chosen. It does mean that not all sex work is always and inherently coerced. Accordingly, individualist reform efforts focus on decriminalization and regulation, aiming at the empowerment and social inclusion of sex workers, providing workers with access to labor rights, human rights, welfare rights, and social inclusion. This is a very dichotomous debate in which people hold to their positions very strongly, but this is just a normative layer. It's coupled with a factual, as I said, and a strategic layer. So let's look quickly at the factual layer. So in addition to the normative stance on sex work, the formulation of a regulatory approach to sex work can also be constructed by dealing with the facts of the field, and from information on the attributes of sex work in a given society. However, there is an objective difficulty in gaining access to reliable information on any social phenomenon taking place underground, out of public view. Obtaining reliable information about sex work is particularly difficult because of the stigma attached to it and the suspicion of the men and women involved towards the establishment. Like in other fields, the result of studies on sex work often depend on the nature of the questioned population and on the setting in which the questions are asked. So when individuals who had been engaging in street prostitution, which is considered the most harsh and violent part of the sex industry, are questioned when in shelters or in aid centers for individuals seeking to exit the cycle of prostitution, these are usually people who had experienced violence or other challenges in the sex industry. When those questions are sex workers identifying themselves as such, and women who are members in sex workers' organizations, they will usually view sex work as a choice often not even as a bad one. Now, it's difficult to obtain uniform answers in the literature, even to simple questions, like what is the size of the sex industry? So Sweden and the Netherlands, the two examples that I explore in the paper, both countries that have dedicated a lot of resources to dealing with prostitution or sex work, both of them admit to the fact that they still cannot say what is exactly the size of the sex industry. Now, this seems really silly. It seems like, why can't good research be out there? Why is this impossible? It doesn't make sense, right? But unfortunately, it's just the way it is. You see that when any research comes out, it's immediately attacked as being ideological, as being manipulated, as being non-representative, whatever that research is going to say. So the result is that the depiction of the realities of sex work differ greatly from one study to another. Research on sex work, both by structuralists and individualists, is often accused of being ideological and of being unreliable. There's a book called Who Kidnapped Feminism about the kind of data that sometimes exists around feminist issues that focuses on sex work. And as a result of these distortions in the available data on prostitution, the working condition and life circumstance of the men and women that engage in it are really only partly known. Some of the existing research reveals a truly horrifying reality of severe abuse, violence, exploitation, and degradation, as you can see here in Melissa Farley's book and quotation. Another part deals with the day-to-day, more mundane reality of sex work as a working-class job. And still another part depicts prostitution as an enjoyable and fulfilling occupation, as you can see here in Cozy Fabian's quote. It seems that there is insufficient information, insufficient reliable information, to establish any single conclusion either way. It ends up being like some sort of a Rorschach test, that everybody sees whatever they want to see in the readings. But it's difficult to say whether prostitution is good or evil, per se. Presumably, this is because prostitution is not one thing. It's stratified, heterogeneous industry. And research tends to reduce the prostitute to one character, either the victim or the happy whore, without addressing this complexity. However, theoretically, this complexity can be addressed and also find redress in policy around the issue. So this is the factual layer, and I'm going to move now to the focus of this talk, which is going to be the next layer, which is the strategic layer, which ends up being law, and what are we going to do in policy about this. So the normative and factual layers are joined by a strategic layer. This layer brings the feminist governance mode into the forefront and reveals the way governance feminists from different camps develop their positions regarding the appropriate manner to regulate sex work or prostitution. So let us examine briefly the two paradigmatic feminist regimes on the regulation of prostitution in Sweden and in the Netherlands. In both countries, around the turn of the century, and following to the hard work of governance feminists in each jurisdiction, both countries adopted new approaches to the regulation of sex work. Sweden criminalizing demand, criminalizing johns, and the Netherlands legalizing and regulating sex work. So let's briefly look at each one of them and map the costs and benefits and the perhaps surprising similarity and unintended consequences that are perhaps inherent to the regulatory approaches adopted. So let's begin with the Netherlands. So sex work has been legal in the Netherlands since 1996, and in 2000 it was also made legal to employ sex workers and manage a sex business. A prominent element of the Dutch sex work legal regime is the distinction between forced prostitution and trafficking, sex trafficking being illegal, and voluntary prostitution that is an occupation regulated by law. Individualists and sex workers' organizations generally believe that although it's imperfectly implemented, the Dutch regime is headed in the right direction. Supporters of this regime find that the decriminalization of prostitution has reduced to some extent the stigma attached to it, made most of the sex industry less violent and less exploitative, and improved sex workers' access to law enforcement systems and gave them important rights and tools for asserting their welfare and labor rights. But there's a lot of criticism too. The harshest criticism on the decriminalization is, of course, launched by structuralists. So structuralists claim that the Dutch case proves that legalization does not lead to the empowerment of prostitutes, but merely to the expansion of their exploitation, making the Netherlands an attractive, safe, and lucrative destination for pimps and traffickers. The main argument in this context is that the expansion of the sex industry, that there is expansion of the sex industry in countries that legalize prostitution, and that this expansion also leads to the expansion of trafficking and to the exploitation of women in prostitution. So the Dutch regime also garners criticism from within the individualist camp, it must be said, although I kind of did it here in a more binary way. Because one of the main criticisms being its limitations to EU nationals, while migrant sex workers do not enjoy any of the benefits afforded to Dutch or EU sex workers. And so the argument here is that non-EU nationals, migrant sex workers, are kind of second-class workers, extremely vulnerable to exploitation within the already low class of sex workers. Moreover, there are two policy decisions that happened in the Netherlands that made achieving the goal of the legalization regime less achievable. So first, it's the labor rights issue. Right, one of the reasons to regulate sex work is because it legalizes, the legalization can bring about workers' rights. But what happened in the Netherlands is that most sex workers are defined as self-employed. They're defined as independent. And as a result, as students of labor and employment law know, they're not workers, and so therefore labor law doesn't apply. Now, this was contested in the courts, and it was contested, not surprisingly, by the tax authorities, and it was found that they are workers in 2008, in a case from 2008. But still, despite the fact that they are formally workers, we know that the studies suggest that the practice is that they're employed as independent contractors and therefore do not enjoy the rights of employees. Second was the fact that when the act passed in 2000, many local authorities froze the number of brothel licenses that they give out. They feared the expansion of the sex industry, and therefore they decided they're not going to give any more. And therefore, unintentionally, this policy created an oligopoly of businesses already operating in the field, and gave these businesses considerable power to determine prices and working conditions in this market, and limited the ability of other players, especially of sex workers themselves, to compete for customers and workers. Meaning that the whole idea of workers organizing for themselves and being their own business owners also didn't quite happen. So let's look at Sweden. In 1999, as I said, Sweden became the first country to criminalize the customers, the consumers of the sex industry. The new act stipulates, and it's part of a Violence Against Women Act, an act to the elimination of violence against women. So the new act stipulated that purchasing or attempting to purchase sexual services is an offense punishable by fines or up to 6 months of imprisonment. Sweden has adopted the structuralist feminist position, and therefore prostitutes themselves are not criminalized. They were perceived as victims of the sex industry, and therefore as individuals who should be saved and should be helped to reintegrate into society. So prostitution itself is perceived as violence against women. The documented effect of the law, as presented by official authorities in the years immediately after it, have been astounding. The authorities claimed that the number of women involved in street prostitution has decreased significantly, that the numbers of men buying sex decreased significantly as well. They talk about 70 to 80% decrease. The Swedish regime is seen by structuralists, therefore, as the solution to the problem of prostitution and trafficking, an ideal regime based on structuralist premises that enjoys generous government funding and broad societal support. So this was the first years, and to some extent this is still the line that the Swedish government pursues. But as time passed, the positive outcome painted by Swedish authorities was cast in doubt. So a 2008 report by the Swedish Ministry of Social Affairs already show that prostitution actually returned to the levels before the legislation, didn't expand, so they see it as a good thing because at least it didn't expand, but it returned to the level before, and that there is no evidence that it decreased. And the main critique launched by sex workers was again launched by sex worker organizations and individualists, and they claim that while there is no decrease in prostitution and trafficking, very real harm is caused to sex workers by the reform. So they claim that the industry didn't disappear, it just went underground. The effect of this is worse working conditions, greater health risks for sex workers, especially there is discussion of condoms being evidence, and so sex workers using less condoms. Those opposing the law claim that the criminalization of customers has reduced women's ability to choose their customer, to negotiate their terms of employment because of the secrecy and haste in which deals are closed. They add that the law led to the persecution and harassment of women undertaking prostitution, particularly street prostitutes, by the police, which led to the sex industry, as I said, going underground. The social marginalization of prostitution has led to the introduction of criminal elements into the industry and increased prostitutes' dependency on pimps. The industry going underground also makes it difficult for the welfare authorities to reach out and provide aid to women who are interested in exiting the industry. It is claimed that despite its feminist guise, really the covert agenda of the law was national. Sweden's moral and geographical separation from the EU countries and the prevention of the migration of sex workers from the East European countries, the newcomers of the European Union. Finally, they claim that in the years since it passed, they not claim, actually they show, this is one thing we can show, not one person was actually put in prison for this, but there were fines. But the heavy hand of criminalization didn't actually take place. And actually also judges and politicians and policemen were found to be among customers of prostitutes, showing maybe that the educational project didn't quite succeed either. There's various high-profile cases of politicians, policemen, and judges who were caught purchasing sex. So let's analyze the competing regulatory approaches. So a comparison of the Swedish regime and of the Dutch regime shows that each one of them has advantages and disadvantages for different groups of sex workers, and that none of them inherently benefits the most vulnerable sex workers. Each one of these regimes redistributes power in the sex industry, empowering some elements and eliminating others, but none of them has been successful in its core goal: to abolish prostitution on the one hand, or to make it legitimate, respected, and protected on the other. Abolitionism is the neo-abolitionism is based on a faith in criminal law's power to abolish prevalent social phenomenon. Its necessary implications are an increase in the stigma attached to the criminalized occupation, and enhancement of police involvement, that's what it does, which entails all concerned being at the focus of enforcement, even if not everyone involved is perceived as an offender. And this is what sex workers are claiming. Maybe they're not offenders, but they're still the focus of much police attention, and as a result, police violence and harassment. This is also the reason for the criminalized activity going underground, with the multiple risks involved, and all this without there necessarily being any decrease in the extent of the activity itself. Decriminalization, on the other hand, as we saw, is characterized by a regulatory faith in the positive force of labor law and employment law. The faith is often unjustified. The mere existence of a right does not guarantee its realization. We see it in the Netherlands. The workers are not even workers, and so it doesn't reach them. But even if they were workers, in a neoliberal age of deregulation of markets, it's extremely hard to enforce employment rights and labor rights on precarious types of work, and on excluded and marginalized groups. And so this might be also kind of the idea that if you regulate and legalize, you'll reach these outcomes should be questionable. Moreover, decriminalization is liable to an increase in the extent of the activity. We see it everywhere that it's regulated, without eliminating the stigma attached to it. It's not like in the Netherlands, it's wonderful to be a sex worker. It still carries some stigma, possibly less, but still carries some stigma. And possibly without a significant improvement in the working conditions of those involved. So it's interesting to point out that studies show that despite this apparent dichotomy that we've just painted here between the two different approaches, they can bring about surprisingly similar outcomes. Two scholars, Elizabeth Bernstein and Jane Scowler of, okay, this makes me want to jump something here. Okay, so I'll just run over this quite quickly. So two sociologists in different research, each one of them doing her own research, found that despite the differences between the feminist approaches and despite the differences between the purpose of legislation in Sweden and the Netherlands, there's actually considerable similarity between the implication in the two cases. So the policy exclusion of non-Dutch in the Netherlands and non-Swedish in Sweden of migrants, and the desire for the gentrification and real estate development of areas in Stockholm and Amsterdam are what eventually led to a series of similar implications in both countries. Most of the sex industry, which operates out of public view, that is in apartments and brothels, has remained intact. Street prostitution has been restricted or eliminated in both countries, and the immigration policy against migrant sex workers was toughened. Given the absence of a necessary link that we see here between the normative position and the reforms suggested by the governance feminist camps, combined with the surprising similarity in the consequences of the legal regimes in the countries that have adopted these two divergent governance feminist positions, allows us to begin thinking about the potential there is in severing the Gordian knot between the normative position and the proposed regulatory reform. The Israeli case that I will discuss next provides such a regulatory alternative to both the feminist approaches overviewed in this chapter. So let me run quickly over the elements of the Israeli regime, which I call a hybrid regime. So in recent decades, Israel presents an interesting hybrid of regime. On the one hand, the Israeli legislator is committed to an abolitionist approach that criminalizes pimps and owners of property used for prostitution. On the other hand, prostitution in Israel is mostly practiced visibly with a certain degree of institutional recognition and at a wide zone of toleration from authorities. So scrutinized from the perspective of law and action, Israeli version of abolitionism is transformed into what seems to be kind of a non-cognizable regime in the language of the dichotomized governance feminist discourse. And just to make sure, I don't think that Israel is unique in the mixture of sex work regimes it embodies. In fact, I suspect there is no legal regime that traces exactly the imprint of its de jure origins. Such hybridity, therefore, exists to a certain degree in every legal regime, and we saw it already in Sweden and the Netherlands to some extent. However, it seems that the hybridity in the Israeli system runs deeper because it is manifested in many authorities acting directly contrary to criminal law, in a manner undermining to a considerable extent some of its purposes. But I do think that the distinction is only a matter of degree. So the law in the books in Israel is partial abolitionism. The Israeli Penal Code based on British legislation criminalizes pimps, any person maintaining or renting out a place for the practice of prostitution, and any person living on the earnings of a prostitute, but not the person practicing prostitution herself, and not Johns. Hardly any research has been done on the extent of prostitution in Israel, so the exact scope of the sex industry is difficult to estimate, but it is clear that there was a huge expansion in the sex industry around the 90s with a wave of sex trafficking that came into Israel from the former Soviet Union, a wave of either both migrant sex workers and trafficked sex workers who came in. Israel is one of the only countries around the world today that is said to have curtailed sex trafficking. I have another piece, the one in the Governance Feminism book, that explains why and looks at Israel being a very strong security state as a result to this. But I'm going to put that aside. Perhaps we'll come back to it. So that's the law in the books. The law in action has this in an unorchestrated manner, created a regime of tolerance to sex work. So I'll run through this quickly. There's an Attorney General directive that basically says that prostitution is not going to be it's not going to be investigated unless there are aggravating circumstances, which are, for example, minors, drug use, organized crime, and trafficking. So generally, the idea is that we don't look into regular prostitution. The Social Security and tax authorities recognize sex work as work. Women can, sometimes it works for, it works against them because they come and ask for a Social Security benefit, and then the Social Security administrator says, wait, you have this income from sex work, you're not eligible. But in other times it works for them. They can get worker compensation if they are injured on the job. There was a brothel that was put on fire, and the woman received Social Security. Same for tax authorities. They're expected to pay taxes, and some of them do. Perhaps the most interesting case here is the labor, except the Attorney General, which is a big policy thing, is the labor courts. That when sex workers approached the labor courts and asked to enforce their rights as workers, the labor court basically says, no, this is not a regular work contract. I'm not going to enforce this contract because we have this law in the books. But if I do a purposive analysis and interpretation of the laws, it seems like each and every one of the labor and employment laws should apply, and therefore the workers get the full range of employment protections at the labor courts. And this is in a series of decisions. So the outcome of this, wait, let me see. I kind of wanted to do this quickly. So the if we look at the all of this put together, we get this unplanned and informal zone of toleration and regulation of sex work in Israel. And it reveals a mixed approach that's at the same time both structuralist and individualist, and therefore does not represent any one of these approaches. On the symbolic level, the State of Israel recognizes the harms caused by prostitution and demands its abolition. On the material level, the state recognizes that sex workers also have rights and attempts to afford them the minimum protections stipulated by labor laws and minimum welfare rights. This system, because it is unplanned, is also unstable. Opposition to the trend of recognition of the rights of sex workers can be found in each one of the authorities whose decisions are described above, because many of those who support abolition maintain that the invisible regulation of prostitution operates to the detriment of women and shows a lack of real commitment by the government to the abolition of prostitution. So feminist organizations that support the abolition of prostitution are also fighting this hybrid approach in a way that might change it. And in fact, there is currently an on-demand bill that may pass in coming weeks. So feminist organizations, from a structuralist standpoint, this state of affairs is a form of hypocrisy, right? The state lets women down by failing to live up to its promise to protect them from the violence through the abolition of prostitution. But even from an individualist standpoint, this is a problematic approach because symbolically it marginalizes sex workers and prevents them from being fully socially and economically integrated. Despite the normative inconsistency of the hybrid approach, an examination of its implications and of the potential it shows that it may be capable of improving the situation of sex workers compared with both distinct feminist approaches. Indeed, the legal approach is far from perfect, I must say, at least the situation in Israel. It still contains broad toleration of the exploitation of some sex workers and their social exclusion, and it neither attempts nor succeeds in dealing with the stigma attached to prostitution. But considering the disadvantages of each of the feminist approaches that we've just seen, it seems that from the perspective of sex workers, the hybrid approach can potentially benefit them more than any of the pure feminist approaches, Swedish abolitionism or Dutch decriminalization. So how? Unlike the situation under the decriminalization approach, the state recognizes here that prostitution is not like any other work. It involves a special, although not inherent, risks. and it often harms, and it may harm those who undertake it. Therefore, the state is committed to abolish this phenomenon, or more precisely, abolishing its most negative aspects. This, of course, has implications beyond the symbolic level. So, for example, since 2008, government ministries are making efforts to help women women who choose to leave the cycle of prostitution. So the Ministry of Welfare funds several facilities and programs for this purpose, and there are other NGOs that work in this vein. Projects of this kind are prevalent under an abolitionist approach, but conflict with the legalization approach and do not exist under it. So an attempt to assist women who want to leave the sex industry. In these circumstances, enforcement efforts can be dedicated to prostitution with aggravating circumstances. Theoretically, this can also be done under decriminalization. In fact, that's what the Dutch said. They said, we're going to focus our attention on exploitative elements of the sex industry. But the Dutch experience shows that the broad toleration of sex business by the decriminalization regime and the autonomy it affords them made it very difficult for the police to regularly monitor their activities and what's happening in brothels. In fact, it can be argued that the successful campaign to end sex trafficking, which characterized the Israeli sex industry during the 90s that I mentioned before, was a product of this hybrid approach. The focused enforcement policy, combined with the relative visibility of the sex industry, enabled by this toleration, allowed considerable police resources to be directed at sites in the sex industry that were suspected of trafficking in women. The result was frequent police raids on brothels, focusing on locating exploited workers. This was assumed to be non-national workers, so this project had various xenophobic issues attached to it. But the assumption was that migrant women were exposed to exploitation and may be victims of trafficking. In these raids, women were removed from brothels by the police. Exploited women were removed from brothels by the police. Others remained there, and the brothel continued to operate until the criminal prosecution. The women were directed to a shelter where they could begin a rehabilitation process, and others that were not seen as victims of trafficking were arrested and deported. So we need to take that into account as well. So while migrant workers, sex workers who were not victims of trafficking may have paid a heavy price in this process, and again, I go into this in this other paper that in the Governance Feminism book, because they were deported and returned to their countries of origin, many others were freed from a situation of violence, exploitation, and coercion. That's eliminating the most terrible parts of the Israeli sex industry. So the result was a comprehensive change in the sex industry for the better, with migrant women paying the cost, and the abolition of the most serious criminal elements and of the most severe forms of exploitation. Now, this was enabled by the criminalization of the most severe forms of exploitation in the sex industry on the one hand, and by a policy of toleration and relative cooperation between the police and brothels and sex workers working in non-exploitative conditions on the other. So the successful elimination of extremely exploitative sex work in the sex industry is an accomplishment quite unique in this context, and it was accomplished through strict border controls as well, and a lot of police power, which again, I'm not a big fan of. But at the same time, abolitionist criminal legislation also, of course, had negative implication for sex workers, because it increases the stigma and paternalism towards them. And the example I give in the paper is, think about a sex worker in a custody battle, losing custody because of her work. Having said that, studies in Netherlands show that that's the case there as well. It's not like sex work there is considered really legitimate work. So in addition to the advantages that I just mentioned, the question of the abolitionist legislation, there is also informal legalization next to it, and it also has significant advantages for sex workers. Such regulation allows access to the courts for those who have the resources for it, and allows prostitutes to enjoy labor law and national insurance rights afforded to workers. Furthermore, studies around the world show that abolitionism tends to be associated with police power and therefore police violence, extortions, and harassment. But because of the Attorney General directive, and because of the partial abolitionism of the system, until recent years, the police dedicated little enforcement efforts to regular prostitution, prostitution without those aggravating circumstances, and accordingly, sex workers did not suffer much police harassment. Consequently, women felt able, and some still do, to call the police in order to protect them from threatening customers and from violence. Such a reality cannot exist under a fully abolitionist regime when there is huge distrust of the police. However, the hybrid approach is dynamic and unstable. The reinforcement of Israeli abolitionism and the enhancement in recent years of enforcement directed at trafficking in women leaking to the Israeli sex industry have increased police harassment against these women. This is what's making them organize now for the first time. The suggested hybrid approach, on the one hand, can potentially recognize the damage caused by prostitution and attempt to reduce its harmful aspects and aid its victims. And on the other hand, it can potentially give sex workers tools for asserting their rights, obtaining proper working conditions, enjoying the protective net of social security benefits, and being free from police harassment. This middle ground regulatory approach is far from perfect. As a residue of harm for sex workers and exploitation can still remain to some extent. Nevertheless, this approach provides protections and rights to sex workers without falling into the liberal free choice paradigm that can at times characterize the individualist approach. It recognizes the complex reality here. This regulatory approach can be characterized as postmodern and experimentalist in that it does not view sex work as either inherently good or bad, and it leaves room to permit and support sex work whenever it is not exploitative. In a sense, this follows what Annalise Riles, in a very different context of the regulation of global financial markets, termed regulation with a hollow core. In the context of sex work, I argue, regulation will function best if it leaves room for experimental flexibility and adaptation to changing conditions of work and market patterns in this heavily stratified and frequently changing labor sector. The regulatory approach suggested here, under which the law on the books gestures in one way and the law in action heads in another, can be countered with two related objections. First, it can be criticized as contradicting notions of an orderly rule of law. And second, it can be seen as leaving too much room for discretion. The critiques are related, since it is the discretion of street-level bureaucrats that creates the mismatch between the law on the books and the law in action. Both criticisms, therefore, relate to the imperfect relation between the law in the books and the law in action. Indeed, a downside of such reflexive hybridity is that the hollow core will necessarily be filled with the discretion of street-level bureaucrats. Policemen and women, tax officials, social workers, prosecutors, trial court judges are the ones who get significant input in the decision whether to utilize the rule or not, whether to see a certain situation as including aggravating circumstances or not. This approach requires focusing our attention on the discretionary power of bureaucrats, and as such, it meets the feminist critique of bureaucracy as a site of hierarchy and domination. Moreover, this regulatory approach requires imagining the discretion will be used appropriately, at least some of the time or most of the time, to capture and prevent exploitative and abusive working conditions and permit uninterrupted other sexual transactions. However, as the discussion of the Dutch and Swedish case shows, none of this is avoidable under any regulatory approach. It's exactly the same situation in the Netherlands and in Sweden. And in fact, denying these elements in other sites is one of the causes of the characteristic flaws in the two traditional feminist approaches to the regulation of sex work. And again, note the fact that in Sweden, nobody sat in jail because of this, right? It was a discretionary moment of both police and of judges. Moreover, as the literature on street-level bureaucracy shows, the problem of bureaucratic discretion is inherent in the operation of all bureaucratic systems. This approach includes a built-in, the hollow core approach, includes a built-in preference towards the decision makers that have the most information about the situation because they are on the ground. Of course, if police or any other public agent is corrupt, racist, chauvinist, or criminal, then this will backfire. And in a system when there is no support, no confidence between society and police, it's difficult to give this discretion to police. But note that police always uses this discretion. So this is not unique to the hybrid approach. Corrupt street-level bureaucrats will thwart any policy. What the proposed system provides is more levers for sex workers to pull to protect themselves, stand for themselves, and promote their rights, including the levers of criminal law. And as such, I argue, it holds promise. And it focuses our attention on these moments of discretion. Following Riles, I argue that demanding that the law in action follows the law in the books may miss the power and transformative promise of such reflexive processes that may, as Riles says, set in motion new ways of collaborations that has profound transformative effects. Okay, then I think I'm gonna leave it here. Thank you very much.
That's a stunning performance, Hila, especially knowing that you've just flown here from Tel Aviv. And after how many hours in an airplane coming and delivering that address? I'm exhausted just by being in your presence. I'm grateful to y'all for inviting me to come and talk. I am a sociologist. I'm not a law scholar. And as a sociologist, I don't need to think about laws. I don't need to think about making laws. I basically just criticize laws for the negative impact that they have on the people that I study. Mostly I study women in the workforce, but in general, my role is mostly as a social critic, not as somebody who actually tries to make law better or use law in the pursuit of social justice. So my role is a lot easier than yours, although I definitely applaud your effort to bring nuance to, in my opinion, a very tired debate about sex work. This whole conversation about whether sex work is oppressive or liberating to women has been going on since forever, certainly since I've been in the business. I remember the Barnard Conference in 1980, where feminists basically went to war with each other over this issue. We called them the feminist sex wars, about this question. You know, there's been iterations of this debate throughout society, politics, research. There was a valiant attempt in the 1990s to bring the two perspectives together. That was Lynn Chancer's book, Reconcilable Differences, where she tried to come up with some kind of dialectic movement on this tired debate. I really like your urging us to kind of go beyond it with this hybrid approach. You know, we have to stop thinking that there's a one right way and perhaps look to alternative models. But I gotta say, when I was reading this paper, well, I have some questions for you. Let's just put it that way. I have 4 different questions. Number 1, why should we care about prostitution? I don't care about it anymore. I'll say more about each one of these. These are my 4 questions. Why should we care about prostitution? Number 2, what is sex trafficking? I was thrilled by your video because the video seemed to encapsulate for me everything I was thinking about while reading the paper about what the next step ought to be. It sounds like it's really a movement in a very appealing direction. The third question is a question I almost never ask, but I'm going to ask it here. Where are the men in this analysis? In particular, men who are prostitutes. Where do they fit in this kind of feminist framework about the harms of prostitution? And then finally, and this is just a sociology nerd in me, I'm very intrigued by your claims about inadequate data on sex work, the extent of prostitution. I'll have less to say about this, but it can be summarized in 2 words: the internet. I mean, I just feel like, you know, any attempt to gauge the ubiquity of sex work has to take on the existence of the internet in our lives and social media. And it is such a ubiquitous force, and sex work is such an important part of people's transactions on the internet. I think that, I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, how can you measure it when it's going on probably in the room next door? I mean, it's just constantly going on everywhere. Probably some of you are doing it right now on your laptops. Those of you who are not looking bored at this point are probably do that. So let me just say a few brief things about each one of these things. First of all, why care about prostitution? You know, to answer this question, you first have to identify what the harm of prostitution is. And from your paper, what I understand the people who are battling this out on legal terrain are arguing is that the harm of prostitution and the need for legislation is to protect women. Women need to be protected, and in particular, our dignity needs to be protected. And there's something about prostitution that goes against our dignity. And so we need laws to protect women and our dignity. And I gotta tell you, anytime anyone tries to protect my dignity, I know that they've got an ulterior motive. That approach has virtually never done anything for the benefit of women. I mean, you can look just historically since the beginning of time. Efforts to protect our dignity have done nothing more than sequester us and silence us, and usually keep us in soft padded indoor rooms. So I'm just genuinely suspicious of anyone and any law that singles out women for our protection and our dignity. I would ask, you know, these groups, and I think that, you know, your new organization that you're talking about is exactly sort of speaking to this concern that I have, because I've written down here, how do demands for either abolition or decriminalization advance economic justice and personal liberation for women? Now that's feminism. You know, for me, it's like, well, let's get a movement for economic justice. Let's get a movement for personal liberation for women. I don't see how either of these two approaches have anything to do with those ends. I don't care about prostitution. I'm just going to say it right there. I was a lousy choice for a commentator on this paper for this reason. Or the best. However, I do care about violence against women. I care about that. I care about the economic exploitation of women. And as I think I see your movement in this new organization, that's what it seems to be about. You know, focusing on these behaviors, these situations that women find themselves in. Do they overlap with prostitution? Sure they do. Do they overlap with working at Walmart? Yes. Do they overlap with being a law student at the University of Texas? Yes. So really kind of zooming in on what these harms are and thinking in feminist ways about how to advance women's liberation and perhaps even our equality with men seems to me a much better approach than worrying about doing away with prostitution. There's a book I recently read about teen pregnancy. Teen pregnancy is like prostitution in this way. They're both a distraction from the real social problems, what you're calling the roots or the structural roots of the problem. They're issues that kind of rile people up on both sides of the political spectrum. And they get us trying to solve problems that aren't necessarily there and aren't necessarily, whose interventions aren't necessarily appreciated by the people who they're designed to protect. So I think of prostitution as a distraction from the major issues of violence against women and the economic exploitation of women, and those are indeed and should be the focus of our feminist activism. The second topic is what is sex trafficking? much of your text, and it is a really wonderful text, and I do encourage you all to read it. Much of the text actually is about sex trafficking, and you will notice when Hila was talking, we often went between talking about prostitution to talking about sex trafficking and the impact of the law on the one and then on the other, and then how sex trafficking figures into the discourses that are promulgated by these different regimes. It seems to me that everyone, all feminists disagree about legalizing prostitution, but everyone discussed in this text agrees about the harms of sex trafficking and the need to do away with it. So there's a point of agreement. We all agree that sex trafficking is a bad thing. I don't know what it is. I don't want it either.
That's why we agree.
But I don't want it, but I don't really know what it is. Maybe that's why. You know, the ethnographic research that I know about that studies sex trafficking really hates that frame, and you know this. Most people who are writing on this issue today in sociology think of sex trafficking as a survival strategy for migrant women. They're often very knowledgeable about the conditions that they're about to enter, these conditions of exploited labor, but they prefer them to the abject wretchedness of their conditions that they're leaving. Criminalizing trafficking by deporting women for their own protection? Come on, people. That's fighting sexism with racism. It's like saying, okay, to protect women, we're gonna arrest and deport the mostly women of color who are crossing national boundaries in order to engage in sex work. Moreover, we're going to arrest the sex traffickers who, according to Bernstein, most of whom are men of color. Yeah. So I'm opposed to sex trafficking, but I don't know what it is, and I know that it's used again as this kind of distraction from talking about what's really going on in terms of labor exploitation in this particular instance. I just wanted to note that I had just read a book about Walmart, which is why I'm going to read you a quote about Walmart. Walmart created a system in which low-priced shrimp in the global north depends on labor and human rights violation and environmental degradation in the global south. Apparently, these subcontractors who get supply shrimp to Walmart stores in this country are based in Thailand, and they hire migrant workers from Myanmar and Cambodia who basically live in near starvation, and they have their passports stolen from them, and they're basically enslaved peoples. But this is what Walmart does. This is the Walmart effect. No other company in the world buys and sells more farm-raised shrimp in Thailand than Walmart. That makes us consumers of trafficked goods, right? So it's like, okay, I mean, again, I go back to your video. I mean, that's perfect. That says exactly what I want to say here. And that is, yes, it's a case of that, and that's bad, but is it the main point, or is it a distraction from the issue of worker exploitation that I think brings us all together? Okay, so, yeah, the next issue I wanted to talk about, one more point about that. There's this weird double standard about migration. So it's illegal to migrate over a national border to engage in sex work, to sell yourself for sex. But it's not illegal to migrate over a national border to buy sex. So
Depends on which country.
depends on what country. So if I decide I'm going to go to Vegas, where everything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? It's almost not going to use the S word. It's a national, it's a state advertising campaign. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They're not talking about marital sex there. You know, it's like, that's boring. They're talking about prostitution with that advertisement. And similarly for sex work in many other countries around the world, certainly that's the case in Costa Rica, certainly it's the case in Amsterdam. These are national campaigns to bring in tourist dollars to take advantage of these industries. So there's this weird double standard at work, is my point, that you're once again in the interest of protecting women and mobilizing them or deporting them, but you're enabling the transportation of men over borders, or women are consumers too. I know that. And I think that that's an important distinction that we need to build in as part of our critique of what this industry is all about. Okay, third, the question of men. Men appear in your work as consumers and or criminals, but men are also sex workers. So how does it change our feminist analysis of prostitution to include them in this model of needing to protect them and their dignity? Well, I refer to Mark Padilla's research on male sex workers in the Dominican Republic. They sell sex to gay male tourists, mainly from the United States. They themselves do not consider themselves gay. They consider themselves straight men who have sex with gay men. Interesting. They lie to their families about what they're doing. There's a cultural sort of tradition of not talking about sex that protects them. At the same time, there's a cultural expectation that men are philanderers, and that of course they're going out at night, and of course they're philandering, because that's what men are. They're horrible human beings, but it protects them. These stereotypes about men and masculinity protects them in terms of engaging in this work, because their families don't know anything about it. So my question is, where's the harm? These men are in it, hopefully to find a sugar daddy that will send remittances to help them support themselves and their families. Relatedly, your account doesn't address the experience of transgender sex workers either. So how, my question to you is simply, how would this complicate these different feminist analyses? And then finally, the nerdy thing about research. I think that sociologists do a better job than what you're suggesting here. I mean, I do know that these two different types of publication, on the one hand, these surveys of people who are seeking, relief or escape from prostitution, well, those are ridiculous. They don't generalize to the entire population of sex workers, nor do, of course, these first-person accounts by mostly middle-class white women who have been liberated by the fun experience of, well, I guess your generation calls them sugar babies, right? Y'all know about sugar babies? Ask each other about what that is. So I do think that there's a third way. There's an in-between way. Don't look it up right now. I tell you what, there's something called a sugar bowl. Anyway, I have a student who's writing her master's thesis about this right now. So there's a lot. My point is, there's a lot of work that's going on here. There's a great new book on Christians who use the internet for partnering, sexual partnering. It's called Christians Between the Sheets, I think it's called. But anyway, there's a lot of people who are interested in this. But to me, the best work is coming out of these transnational ethnographies. And I do think it's very valid work that I think can address the problems and the lapses of both of your perspectives. But it occurs to me that that's exactly the work that you're doing right now with your new organization, and I wish you the best of luck for all of that. Thank you.
All right, so now we have questions, and we usually reserve the first round for the students who are in the seminar. You know who you are. If you don't know, then you're not. So we'll have some questions from the students, and then we'll open it up. And the questions could be directed to either of the two, if Christine is game for that. And then But first, we usually give the speaker the chance to respond if she wants.
So this was, thank you so much. This was very interesting and entertaining as well. So this covers a lot, and I won't be able to do it justice. So I'm just gonna choose two of these and quickly address them. So why should we care about prostitution? I think that is so interesting, because I think that's the question mostly that comes out of feminists outside of law schools. Because in law schools, law is being passed as we speak, and so we have to address it. That relates to the lives of sex workers. And this is kind of like what happens, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but with generally with radical feminism, or kind of McKinnonite type of feminism, it's alive and well in law schools, but when you cross the street to the gender department, people are just looking at you and thinking, why are you still engaging in that old stuff? But in law schools, it's alive and well because it's alive and well in law.
Why?
Because it has a lot of populist power, and legislation is being passed.
You mean like Trump?
Not Trump, but feminists within administrations are passing legislation that tracks and that traces this. Now, some of this can be co-optation. It can be Trump saying, yeah, this is not Trump, let's say Bush with the whole trafficking agenda.
Right.
The whole trafficking agenda it started Clinton, continued Bush, and was the case of strange bedfellows between some feminists and evangelical Christians, and Elizabeth Bernstein again does a great job showing that. But in any case, it's happening. It's real law. And so in law schools, we still do something. We're interested in that because of that. But I think your deep question about why should we care about prostitution is important, because really it's just an example of sometimes exploitative labor sector. And then we need to think about our labor market and the structures within our labor market and how they induce vulnerability to exploitation. And so that's definitely the wider TrafLab project is just about that. But because legislation is being passed, we address it still. But good. But I agree with everything else that you said about this. And then just let me talk about sex trafficking quickly. And then maybe sex trafficking. So trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking being a subset of that, is again a legal category that's been booming since the early 2000s, with the TVPA passed in the US and what is known as the Palermo Protocol, the protocol to prevent the trafficking of women and children, passed as a protocol to the Organized Crime Convention under the auspices of the UNODC, the United Nations Office of Drug and Crimes. It's important because it's not a human rights place, it's a drugs and crime setting where countries do that, they fight crime, or get together to fight transnational crime. So following that moment, trafficking was defined for the first time in international law and in national law, and there's huge institutions that are being created to combat trafficking. There is the trafficking ambassador in the U.S. State Department, anti-trafficking ambassador in the U.S. State Department. There are NGOs that are anti-trafficking NGOs. It's sometimes called in the critical literature the anti-trafficking industrial complex. It's a thing that's happening. And so what is trafficking? Unclear. That's why, for example, in trafficking, in the video, in the clip that I showed you, I say 2.3 million. But if you look it up online, today nobody talks about 2.3 million. That, as I said, it's a modest estimate. They're talking about 20.1 million or a much bigger number. The 2.3 is really the most modest estimate from the ILO. I just used it to show that even if we use that estimate, it's 3% of the people that are being assisted by the current paradigm. But in any case, that's again another numbers battle. But the question, what is trafficking, is just was supposed to be resolved in those documents and wasn't. It's a terrible legal definition. I use it in TrafLab in my project to think about labor exploitation, severe forms of labor exploitation per se, and it's possible under current legal definitions of what trafficking is. You don't need you don't need movements across borders, you don't need deception, you can have exploitation of position of vulnerability. It's a very malleable definition. So what's sex trafficking? It's severe forms of exploitation in the sex industry. That would be my answer. Okay, I'm not going to take the other questions just to leave more time, but I might, other questions about men might come from the audience as well, and I'll go back to that. Thank you.
You can
stay there.
And do you want to call on people, or do you want somebody else?
I can do it, unless Ariel wants to do it, or I just moved the mic. Okay. So, anybody?
In the video you mentioned
If you can just say your name.
Oh, I'm Audrey. I am at the Public Affairs School.
Mm-hmm.
And in the video you mentioned a few different strategies, unionization, corporate social responsibility to fight trafficking. Can you give any hard examples of where those have been implemented or what you've done through TrafLab?
That's the perfect question, thank you. But I feel I can go on about that forever. So, generally the idea, as you saw of TrafLab, is to get away from the criminal perspective. And what we're doing is we're going from the international, which is bilateral agreements, to the local, which would be unionization and sometimes corporate social responsibility if it's worker-driven. So we look at mostly at 4 tools that you saw in the movie: bilateral agreements, regulation of human supply chains, and enforcement of labor laws in national settings, unionization and organization, so unionization but also alt labor, and corporate social responsibility. Each one of these can do something in a certain sector. Our idea is that on their own they can rarely do enough. You need more than that. Each one of them addresses a part of the problem. So let me just give 2 examples. So bilateral agreements on migration it's a relatively new trend in the regulation of migration, in which 2 countries sign an agreement to determine the conditions of migration, usually of temporary guest workers from one country to the next. Israel is actually, in these case studies, I actually don't use Israel that much, but here Israel is again a good example, because Israel signed a bilateral agreement with Thailand. Most of Israel's agricultural workers are from Thailand. Temporary migrant workers that come in for 5 years. They used to pay huge amounts of debt and basically be bonded labor, working to pay off their debts in terrible conditions, and unwilling to leave their employer out of fear that they will not be able to pay their huge debt. So the bilateral agreement has a 3rd side to it. That's the International Organization of Migration. And the International Organization of Migration does the recruitment. It's a weird position for the International Organization of Migration, extremely dubious, very questionable. But in this case, they did the same thing, by the way, with Guatemala and Quebec. Terrible outcomes, corruption through and through. But in this case, so far, it's been extremely transformative to the agricultural sector in Israel. Thai workers that come in stand for their rights. There was a Thai workers strike. They change employers much more frequently. They have very minimal debt when they come in. There's increased litigation in the courts by Thai workers. The hourly wage they receive has improved significantly. A lot of stuff didn't improve, I must say. The hazards, the health hazards that they encounter, other things didn't. So it couldn't work on its own. But this bilateral agreement that basically took away the debt by pushing out private migration industry actors did an amazing thing to this industry. So that's one example. And it was used in an anti-trafficking tool. And other countries are experimenting with bilateral migration agreements that look different. I'll just briefly give another example from the corporate social responsibility and unionization aspects, or like organization, alt labor, which is the Fair Food Program here in the US that many of you may have heard of, the tomato pickers in Florida that basically through pressuring retailers, so Walmart, Target, Whole Foods, I don't know if Walmart is actually part of it. It is, right? To pay cent per pound more for tomatoes. And that scent goes to a monitoring system on the ground in Florida farms to improve the rights of tomato pickers. And they won the anti-trafficking medal under the Obama administration for transforming an industry that a part of the agricultural sector that was extremely exploitative into what is said to be today one of the best places to work if you're a farm worker. So again, these are two examples. They're both extremely context specific. They require, none of this is one size fits all. It requires certain conditions, but what we're doing is we're looking at different case studies and there are examples for other unionization and that I won't go into, but that's the idea, that to look at elements that empower workers, that change the structural conditions that bring about vulnerability to exploitation. By the way, if any of you is interested, we have visiting fellowships, we have postdoc positions. There's going to be a website soon. But if any of you are interested to come and visit at the Traf Lab at Tel-Aviv, email me.
You send those to us.
I will.
Publish them on our website.
Thank you.
So it seems like a lot of your criticism of the human rights paradigm is that it doesn't address the plight of undocumented workers. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about how your labor rights approach could address that plight, and if that has to be in tandem with immigration reform, or if you could just talk more about how that captures that population more in general.
So my critique of human rights is not necessarily that it doesn't address the plight of migrant workers, though in this piece it kind of does. But what happens with the human rights approach, at least in relation to trafficking and sex trafficking, is that it usually is an ex post thing. It's about finding victims. There's a whole rescue industry. You rescue victims, then you provide them, in the little video, little clip, the woman giving the blanket, that's the ex post thing. You're not gearing to transform structures that bring about vulnerability. So you do something exposed. By the way, in many countries, the US included, being a victim of trafficking is perhaps your best bet as an exploited migrant worker to get legal right to stay in the country and to naturalize. It's actually one of the most generous regimes, much better than asylum seekers. I mean, again, could be. Not necessarily because the numbers are extremely low. But at least in the Israeli context and in many European countries, there is no way for any exploited migrant worker who entered the country illegally or legally to naturalize in the country in any other way except being identified as a victim of trafficking or, of course, being granted refugee status. But so it's not that it's actually a really interesting development within the world of migration, the way governments, through a human rights discourse, expanded perhaps created a crack within sovereignist migration regimes to allow people to stay in the country legally and taking responsibility for the kind of violations they had. However, the numbers are minuscule. So it's kind of a fig leaf for countries to say, yes, we're working against exploitation. Look, we have a T visa. How many people get the T visa? Not even the minimum standard set by law. So it's theoretically created a transformation. In reality, not really. My critique of the human rights paradigm is that at least in its form, in when it comes to trafficking. But as David Kennedy and the Dark Side of Virtue shows, it's much wider. But we definitely, trafficking is a classic example. It kind of normalizes a lot of exploitation, makes only a subset of exploitation something we address, and then within that subset, still cherry picks what Kennedy calls the baby seals, right? The innocent victims that we can't attribute any agency to. So that's basically the main critique of the human rights approach here. Yes.
Hi. So I had a question about neo-abolitionists and kind of their viewpoint of male prostitution in light of their concept of society and how prostitution is kind of inherently, innately violence against women. What is their response or rationale for male prostitution?
The short answer is they don't address it. The longer answer would be that male sex workers are basically fully feminized in this. They're seen as an example of women. So they are penetrated, and just like women are penetrated, and they are in a position of domination, what is seen by abolitionist sex workers as domination and subjugation that is similar to that of women's. And the classic example perhaps is Catherine McKinnon's, I think it was amicus brief that she gave in the Onacle case. I never know if I pronounce it correctly. Onacle. Onacle. There you go. I'm not a native English speaker, allowed. The Onacle case.
I just happen to know one legal case.
And I cited it.
I know.
Sink. Okay, so in the Onacle case, that Christine knows better, maybe you want to talk about it, it was about an oil rig and this masculine culture on an oil rig and the question of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation. And basically the file Catherine McKinnon filed there was basically saying he's like a woman, right? The way he was treated is he was more feminine, so he represents the woman, and so it's the same thing. Everything everything female, feminine, femme, in this in our world order is subject to patriarchy in a similar way. And so male sex workers, the fact they happen to be biologically male doesn't matter. They're feminine for the sake of argument. But maybe I can kind of link this to Christine's question about men in my piece. Yeah, I hardly mention them, and I think I have a footnote which I try and explain it away, but of course it's not convincing. Why don't I mention them? Because the reason is that I'm looking at this as a governance feminist project, and the feminists are not really interested in men here, I must say. And so I kind of do the same sin, I would say, and I have no really good way to justify it, except that the legal discussion around this really is not about men.
No, don't get me wrong, I don't want you to talk about men.
You're just curious about...
Talk way too much about men.
Generally.
I like that you're talking about women, but my question is similar to yours. How do you maintain this view that prostitutes are in need of protection and dignity when it doesn't appear that men prostitutes need this kind of intervention? They don't need our help in the way that women need our help.
So, first of all, definitely that not the position I hold about the protection, but I think my answer here is then becomes that answer. It's about really symbolizing femininity. Femininity doesn't have to be biological; it can be cultural for this sense, and so transgenders. But it goes the same way. But we had a lunch with some of the people here earlier, and I talked about within the sex worker organization that I'm part of now. It's the first time this is happening in Israel. It's all the spectrum of gender identities is part of it. Few men, by the way, but they're still there. Lots of transgenders, either way, in all directions and in all stages of transition. And the transgenders are really kind of thinking whether they need to have their own agenda. And part of it, and I was talking about it before, so I'll just mention it briefly, part of it is that they feel that the agency attributed to them is different than the one, so the discussion of transgenders in the sex industry is different than women, because women are seen as completely agency-less and as complete victims of the system, while women and children, just like the Palermo Protocol, which is the protection of women and children, while transgenders are actually seen as having a lot of agency because they're going through a process that is against society and against societal expectations from them. And so while sex workers who are doing this are also going against societal expectations of them, this is not seen at all and is seen as part of their false consciousness, again, by neo-abolitionists and by people promoting repressive legislation. While transgenders is a different thing because they clearly have agency. So we can't really dismiss them as being victims. They're victims of patriarchy in a different way. They're victims of patriarchy because the transition makes them outsiders to the patriarchal order. And so they are full of agency, but they have no room in this binary patriarchal order. And so they, we need to provide them with will say, the neo-abolitionists would say, we need to provide them with occupational, we need to change society to reduce discrimination. That's what we do with transgenders, not with women, but with transgender. And so they feel like they occupy a different situation because the policy response by also neo-abolitionists towards them is different. So.
So I have something that is a little bit of a follow-up to that, but I wanted to talk about the sociology. To talk about the sort of core of your proposal, of your policy proposal, which is about hybridity. And it seems to me that there's, that you're still asking law to outlaw sex work. Rather than saying, like, wouldn't it be better then to just have a law that says, look, you can't use violence and you can't use coercion and you can't use fraud to get people to do this kind of work, and if they're doing this kind of work they have to be compensated adequately and they have to have dignified conditions of employment, period. And that's the end of it. I mean, why criminalize on the one hand but then create space for sort of toleration in the middle?
So this is the place where I'm ambivalent. And it ends up being for me that I don't think, and this is the sentence that is difficult for me to say, I don't think sex work is work like any other. I do think it has particular vulnerabilities in the current social order that requires special attention and tools to it. And I say it from being in touch with so many sex workers over the years and hearing their stories. My sense is, and you know, the Workers' Rights Clinic, we mostly work with domestic workers, construction workers, other vulnerable populations, and you know, in some sense, no work is like other work, right? Domestic work, or especially gendered work, right? Is domestic work like any other when it's in the house of the employer? No, it's also unique, and it also, by the way, requires unique labor and employment laws to it. When we're thinking about the regulation of time and in a live-in domestic workers situation, we need new tools that usually labor and employment law have something similar but not exactly the same. So I think there are various, and actually thinking about, I can think about construction as having its own particular elements. You know, when you look closely at each one of these labor sectors, they feel very unique. And I feel that sex work is unique in ways that because of the sexual intimacy that's involved in it, causes specific forms of vulnerability that I do think criminal law can address. Now that's my ambivalence. Saying that, it's difficult for me. It's a difficult position for me to take, and I immediately want to erase it and say, no, it's just like any other work, and there's no such thing as trafficking. There's just labor trafficking, and all trafficking is the same. And I kind of feel both of them, and what I'm trying to do with the hybridity is to hold both these positions, to have a mostly decriminalized system with criminalization of the edges. And that's where I'm uncertain, I must say. And I see Dan and Christine.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, you know, I know some of the people at the Fair Food Standards Project, and they were recently involved in a criminal prosecution for slavery, right? So they run a hotline, and they get calls from people who say, you know, they're not putting up shade for us at our breaks, but then they got a call from somebody who said, you know, they hold us overnight
Captive.
in a locked room.
Yeah.
They let us out to work and they bring us back in and lock us up again. They don't let us talk to anybody. They took all our cell phone, right? And so and they did the obvious. They called the cops, right? And brought in the prosecutors, and there was I mean,
You can still use that, you say, even
it
when
seems
it's
like
not
that's
sex work.
still there, right? I mean, it doesn't. So anyway, that's just even
But-
in.
Yeah,
But-
and I've heard the same about raisin picking. So everybody involved in making raisins feels, like it's horribly damaging work. But the word that you used that tripped me up is intimacy. You said that the specific vulnerability has to do with the intimacy of
Intimacy,
the
yeah.
labor. So I want to just kind of push you on what that means, because your intimacy may not be my intimacy. And in
I
fact,
just
a lot
mean-
of
sorry, yeah.
a lot of sex workers say that they like sex work more than having sex with their husbands, because they can draw the line in terms of what they can and can't do, which you can't really do when it's your husband. So a prostitute can say no kissing, or the prostitute can say, okay, you're done here now, and walk away, which she can't say to her husband. So what do you mean by intimacy? I mean, Bernstein thinks that the whole intimacy thing is this middle-class white woman thing, that we all think that sex is just for intimacy. And, these young people out here, they don't think that way anymore. They all are into the hookup, where sex is not about, no, I've read about it, no. Sex is no longer about intimacy. Sex is about getting smashed and doing it in the road with someone you don't even know. So what is intimacy?
So I actually, the word intimacy, I was thinking about having two people, sometimes more, but often two, in a room, and that's it, and that's all you have. So it's not.
Seclusion, then.
It's the seclusion, and that's why I kind of connected it to domestic work, because I think it exists in the care industry as well in a similar way, but and I do see a continuum here, but I wanna answer that with Dan's question as well, because let's see if I'm making sense here. So what happens in labor trafficking and with the FFP, which is again a wonderful project, but is that there is no constant monitoring of police and what happens in farms. They have no idea. If that person would not call a hotline, and if there was no hotline, nobody would know, basically. What I'm hoping for the sex industry is that there will be monitoring, that somebody will care. And for that, I feel like we need the criminal law, because it's the problem of monitoring, and that's a problem. It's a huge question about what do police forces do, police generally does in relation to labor trafficking. So many police departments around the world opened and trafficking, and I'm talking about labor trafficking, not sex trafficking, labor trafficking departments. And these departments end up not doing a lot. The police is just not well equipped in enforcing labor and employment rights, nor should they, right? But now trafficking is a crime, and they need to do something about it, and they don't know how to do it. What I see in relation to prostitution is that over the years, because police had interaction with the sex industry, they do know what to do to some extent. Now, this is a problem of discretion. They may be doing all the wrong things, but they have a close relationship with the actors in the field, unlike what happens in farms or factories and all of that. And so that's the place that I want to keep alive. I want to have that relationship with the fact that this is still, there should be a police unit that knows how to do this. When I say know how to do it, I put a lot of faith in police departments. And that's an issue. And I said the discretionary element here, again, in the current moment in the US, it's difficult to say that we trust police. But in many other places around the world, Israel being one of them, but many places in Europe as well, police is a force of social change. I mean, it can be a force of actual policing that is good for the community. And so, again, not always, and I'm always suspect of police power, and there's, especially when it comes to sex work, but there are other examples, and I want to use that, and I think we need that, and I think that's part of and again, maybe the word choosing the word intimacy wasn't a good word to use here. But I think also that's also part of it, the really invisible elements here when it's not done in the streets. And fewer prostitution is street prostitution, especially in the age of the internet that you mentioned before.
But don't they all have cell phones that they can take pictures and make calls from in this room with only 2 people in it?
If they have their cell phone, if it wasn't taken away from them, and if the customer doesn't see, I mean, customers want their privacy. They're very suspicious of cell phones. And so, I mean, it's a complicated arena. It's not that simple. Yeah.
There's a good chance my question is going to come out as very or ill-informed.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So I'm thinking about this idea of sex work specifically being outside the realm of other types of labor, alienation of labor, and I'm wondering if there's much legislation anywhere that's trying to take advantage of this specialness, this like preciousness of that, this need to be protected. And I totally understand your resentment against the idea of protection. Because it seems like an avenue that people working for equity within any realm of labor can exploit that special idea about it. For some reason, my mind is going to like actors and like, okay, so you can say that maybe outlaw anything less than 90% of the labor of the money paid for that labor. 90% has to go to the person performing that action, and then 10% goes to the agent, like something like that, right?
That
So,
never happens, but
yeah. Okay. But I'm just wondering if there's any other any avenue where that is being taken advantage of, the specialness of sexual exploitation specifically.
I'm not sure I understood, so let me try and respond, then correct me. I think from my standpoint, the only people who know what sex workers need are sex workers. And that's why I think sex workers organizations are workers organizations are crucial everywhere, because generally workers know, construction workers know best, farm workers know best. That's my position as someone who believes in labor. But I think it's particularly true in the sex industry because of all the moral baggage that people come to this discussion with. And so I think the important thing about sex workers organizations is that they know the vulnerability more than any of us can imagine. Maybe we can be very imaginative about it, but they know best. And so I think in terms of, I'm not sure I understand what do you mean by exploiting the uniqueness, but for me, the only way to understand the uniqueness is to listen to sex workers. And because you gave the example of agents, and that seemed to me like you're saying maybe we can take other characteristics from other labor industries and see how they apply here. But I don't know if that's what you're asking, because then I can talk about that too.
Not necessarily, but are there? I think using and if it's if it's from the voice of sex worker unions or something like that,
or organizations. It doesn't have to be union.
Taking advantage of the biases that we have, the taboos that we have against the moral implications of sex work, and using that to make legislation to make it a more equitable industry in any way. The acting was just a bad example.
If I understand what you're saying, I think that what I'm trying to push for in this paper is to make use of the fact that there is this questionable will to protect sex workers in order to get more enforcement and for workers' rights in a way that perhaps will not be possible in relation to farm work or construction work. And we see that there are various types of industries, fishing being one of them, for example, the shrimp example, that is now there's more international awareness and to the slavery-like conditions, the modern day slavery in fishing. But there are all these other sectors that if you look at statistics of again, if I use the trafficking prism of labor, of criminal investigations, of T visa recipients, they are few around the world. The US State Department has an annual trafficking in persons report they do, which kind of ranks all countries around the world. You know, Janie Chuang calls this the US as a global sheriff, kind of puts everyone according to how well they do in relation to enforcing minimum standards of anti-trafficking, and they have this little table every year of number of prosecutions, convictions, and identifications of victims of trafficking, and they have like the number, and then in brackets they put the number for labor trafficking, and the number for labor trafficking is minuscule. So you know that 3% that I said, it's maybe 0.3% of that. And I think the reason for that is because it doesn't garner the same interest as exploitation in the sex industry. So I think in that sense, that uniqueness is something that I'm trying to perhaps use to bring more attention to the exploitative parts of the industry, but hoping that it will allow us to legitimize other aspects of the sex industry.
So that brings us to the end of the hour. So thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Hila.
Thank you very much.